Time and Tide by Misdemeanor1331. Chapter 6. Warning: this chapter contains typical violence, mild gore, and minor character death. Hermione caught an eastward current and let it hurry her to Edinburgh. She breached at the familiar New Haven lighthouse. Night and the temperature had fallen sufficiently to send people into their homes, so Hermione heaved herself onto the dock in the harbour and shed her skin. Folded a sealskin over her arm and disillusioned herself with a sharp rap to the top of her head. She made her way over to docks and into the city proper at a careful half-jog. Disillusionments weren't foolproof, but they were more effective at night when the light didn't refract and glimmer. The streets were empty, the sidewalks bare. She navigated through the district without issue. She turned down a side street and used her wand to tap a precise pattern of knocks on the door. It unlatched, swinging forward on silent hinges and granting her entry into a dark storage space. She mounted the stairs to the living level, wand drawn. It was near midnight, so quiet was to be expected. It was also George and Lee, so this brand of quiet, total, weighty, and tense, felt wrong. She paused at the top of the stair. Omenum Revelio. Nothing. Stomach fell, dread creeping over her like an unwelcome fog. After locking the door behind her with a quick charm, Hermione sent a lumos into the living level. She took a breath, braced herself, rounded the corner, and immediately sagged against the wall. George and Lee lay sprawled up on the floor, necks slit like bloody smiles. Ethereal sprays arced across the threadbare sofa, the papered walls and white ceiling. There once lay beside them, spellfire evidenced by signed holes punched through the walls and a dining table blown to pieces. They'd fought, and fought hard. Hermione sheathed her wand and shuffled forward on numb legs. She sank to the floor between them, closing their empty eyes with a touch. Time blurred as she mourned them, hours passing as minutes, or perhaps minutes as seconds. What was the point of it all? What did their death mean in the grand scheme? The Edinburgh connection was lost, but only for now. Would be relocated, re-staffed. They were replaceable. Only one person wasn't. Only Harry. He had to end this. It had to end. Knees sore and creaking, Hermione got to her feet and drew her wand. There was not enough happiness in the world to summon a corporal patronus, but the order needed to know. She closed her eyes. Expecto Patronum. A faint white wisp appeared. She whispered to it. Edinburgh has been compromised. George Weasley and Lee Jordan deceased. Safe house cleared by Hermione Granger. She paused. Patronuses were not often sent. Too easily intercepted, too easily adulterated. Couldn't risk telling too much of her plans. Or of Draco. Heading south overland. I suffered a serpent's bite, but the path ahead remains green. Vague, but hopefully it was enough. She swept the house next, moving room by room. Exploration methodical and thorough. George and Lee were experienced enough not just to order intelligence, but there were other things worth keeping. She found a bag hanging on the door to George's room. She extended and waterproofed it, gathering what she could not bear to lose. Photo of Fred, George, and Lee, framed and set bedside. A cache of Weasley's Wizard Weez's products, George and Lee's wands. She ended in the kitchen. An inventory of their cupboard served to restock her own food supply. She debated over 2 bottles of vodka and ended up taking them both, then collected the entire array of potions for healing and sleep. At the top of the staircase, she turned for a final look. With a whispered curse, she set it alight. So flame that knew its boundaries and burned hot enough to consume flesh and bone. By morning, there would be no trace of them. The journey back to Inchgarvey was long. Hermione struggled against the currents and the drag of the bag across her shoulders. When she made land, still under the cover of darkness, She was fully exhausted. She shed her skin with a shudder and dragged herself up the rocks which cut against the soft soles of her bare feet. Draco was still there. He sat with a raincoat bunched over his hips, a phoenix pendant dangling from his fingers, glinting in the strange blue firelight. She looked at him, bleary-eyed, and dropped her sealskin by the pile of clothes she'd shucked a couple hours earlier. "Thought you'd be gone," she said. "So did I." Draco watched her dress. She was beyond caring. Let him look if he wanted to. Hermione tossed him the new bag. "Replenished our supplies. We should consolidate." She tried to sound dispassionate, but reality rose like a tide around her. The actualization of why she'd been able to replenish those supplies. What it had cost a world for her to gain a few days of food. Grief wrapped itself around like a noose around her throat. She didn't try to speak. "Are you okay?" She shook her head. "What do you need?" Draco's attempt at empathy were enough to pull the noose taut. She cracked under the strain and fell to her knees, the sobs coming freely. Chest heaved. She couldn't breathe. Then his arms wound around her, pressing her back against his chest. He held her tightly, but even so her breath seemed to come a little easier. He eased her down before the fire and curled himself around her, his knees tucking up under hers. He pillowed her head with his arm. Draco offered no other comfort than the presence of his body, the warmth of a person who had grieved his own losses in his own time. She neither asked nor needed any more from him. Eventually, she fell asleep in his arms. Hermione woke mid-morning to the smell of warm beans. Draco had pulled away from her at some point last night, leaving her sealskin folded like a pillow beneath her head. He dressed and perhaps attempted to wash with the soap she'd brought from Edinburgh's safe house. At least their eastern fortress smelled a measure less ripe. Hermione rubbed the crust from her sore eyes and sat up. Draco offered her the bean tin and a canteen of water. "We need a next step," he said. Hermione nodded. Inchgarvy's fortress was a welcome respite, but temporary by nature. The Death Eaters would surely look here once they realized that the Carers had failed their objective. Draco seemed to be thinking along the same lines. "They'll have deployed a scout by now," he said. "Maybe two. Once they have our most likely location, they'll attack. We have until nightfall by my estimate. We need to go get to Wiltshire before then." She looked up from her tin. Though Draco hadn't changed at all, he looked different to her now. A shred of humanity colored his eyes, a spark of light within the matte grey. "You still plan on using me as leverage?" "I don't know yet." Her hackles rose. "I thought you wanted out. You were still here last night. I thought that meant—" "Weasley and Jordan are dead," he reminded her, needlessly but not cruelly. It was a statement of fact. "Nothing's changed. The Order can still help you. I can still—" "It's not just about me, is it?" His eyes flashed, and she must have recoiled because he took a steadying breath. "You were right about my parents," he admitted on the exhale. "He's using them, and I need them out. Not both, then at least my mother. We get them, and the Order gets me. Full cooperation. Those are my terms." "How do I know I can trust you?" "Because we're in this together now. Our fates are tied." Hermione looked back down at the empty tin. That was right. She'd saved his life. He was indebted to her now, and the connection ran far deeper than a promise. He was obligated to her. "Why haven't you been using magic?" His back straightened, and expression turned guarded. "Now isn't the time." "It is," she said. "If we're in this together, then we need to understand what we're working with. No more secrets." She saw the debate within him, and the acquiescence. He held out his left forearm, where the dark mark undulated across his pale skin. "It's a summoner and tracker," he said. "Whenever any Death Eater performs magic, the Dark Lord knows our location." "How?" "You think he'd tell me?" Draco's voice was incredulous. "Or anyone else. He knows, and that's enough. That's why you didn't want to apparate, she said as the pieces connected, or cast an impervious or a warming charm. He nodded. The spells I cast yesterday will bring them to Queensferry. I'd rather not cast any leaving. Apparitions leave a double-ended trace, where you were and where you are. Can you use my wand? No. Even if you won't let me, it's still my magic, just through a different vessel. And if I take you via side-along? He raised his shoulder in a half-shrug. I don't know. It's magic acting on me, but no magic I've cast. It would be a risk. Hermione frowned. It was quite a big risk. Even if they apparated to an order safe house, its resident wouldn't be prepared for a fight if the Death Eaters followed. They'd have the advantage of familiar ground, but not much else. Can we steal a broom? She made a suggestion, but her stomach still turned at the thought. Hermione suffered from motion sickness and much preferred flying through the water than through the air. Do we have the time? We'd need to find a shop, disable or break through the security charms, and then evade medical law enforcement, as well as the Death Eaters. Not like there's much of a difference. He ceded with a roll of his eyes. Besides, don't we already have an alternate method of transportation? His eyes dropped to her sealskin. Hermione pressed her hand into it, the familiar warmth providing little comfort in the face of his request. It's not that simple, she said. The ocean waters are freezing. You'd become hypothermic. We take breaks. They'd have to be long ones. I'd be carrying you and our bags. The Queensferry Pier to here exhausted me. I could take us short distances, down the coast a few miles, so long as the current was friendly, but neither of us would be good for much else afterwards. We need recovery time, and if we're fighting time, we are, then we shouldn't rely on the sea. Draco frowned. We need to get off this island. I know, I think apparition is our best bet. Granger. We could cover extensive ground that way, she said, counting off the advantages on her fingers. I know London well enough to get us there in one piece. If any Death Eater do follow us, the city is large enough to lose them. It's our safest option. We have a large cell in London, Draco said. Large enough to cause trouble if something goes wrong. The Order has a house there too, she said. Any trouble your side makes, we would match by mine. In fact, London was the Order's headquarters, but she didn't feel the need to clarify that particular point. Tied though their fates might be, and however intent Draco seemed on defecting, he'd not yet done so. Until he and his parents were safely in Order custody, until he was vetted via legilimency and veritaserum, she had to assume he was playing her. So we get to London, hide from both our sides, and keep heading toward Wiltshire, he summarized. She nodded. As a next step, it wasn't bad. There was more to consider. How many people are at Malfoy Manor? Just my parents. You're sure? Yes. They fell out of favor after the stalemate at Hogwarts. The Dark Lord relocated his headquarters. To where? His eyes narrowed. You think I'd tell you? She took the leap. It's the Isle of Men, isn't it? Draco said nothing, just kept his gaze steady, giving her all the confirmation she needed. The Order had long suspected that Voldemort had claimed the island for himself. Have you been there? She asked. What have you seen? Draco shook his head. Amnesty first, then formation. To that end, when do we leave? What time is it? Draco checked his watch. Nearly noon. Let's pack up then, she said. The wards I cast are probably expired by now, and I don't want to give your people any more opportunity than necessary to find us. Stranger's voice echoed from the western wall, hissing amusement that made the hair on Hermione's arm stand straight. Too late, it said. Hermione swept her wand sideways. A gust of wind toppled Draco from his seat, sending him skidding across the stone floor. Collided with the wall, an oof of breath driven from his lungs. The curse meant for him struck her instead, a rocket of violent orange that exploded in her face, sending her backwards and multiplying her senses. 1,000 bright lights appeared behind her eyes as her head struck the floor. Shouts echoed around her, magnified, deafening. She pressed her hands to her ears and rolled to what she hoped was a shadowed corner. She blinked, her eyes straining to focus on just one of the kaleidoscope of figures scrabbling in the fortress' dim blue light. Sunlight exploded through one of the windows, its temporary covering blasted off by a spell. There was the flat crack of 100 fists against 100 jaws, the crunch of a dozen noses breaking, the gurgling cry of one man pinned. Draco's hand squeezed their assailant's bloodied throat, and the handle of Hermione's contraband knife jutted from his shoulder. Draco's chest heaved as he pressed a knee into the man's sternum. Head continuing to clear, Hermione found her wand and crawled over, pressing the tip of it to the Death Eater's temple. She recognized him. Scabia.
"Who else is with you?"
Draco asked, his question breaking free between clenched teeth. Scabia's mouth stretched in a blood-stained smile.
"Kill me if you want to, Rita. I'll die knowing the worst has already been done. Who else?"
Scabia began to laugh, dark eyes rolling, and he spat a gob of bloody phlegm onto Draco's cheek. Hermione cast. A delicate, dark spell, one of the few she could stomach, sent a small worm of electricity through the nerves of Scabia at his temple. The slow-moving current spread through his neural network like a fungus, triggering his synapses and sending constant spasms of pain through the affected area. The longer she held it, the deeper he hurt. The veins in Scabia's neck bulged beneath Draco's fingers. Hermione counted 5 seconds before a scream rasped from his throat, the sound of his kicking heels reverberating through the stone fortress. Hermione ended the spell and the pain disappeared. No lasting harm done.
"Who else is with you?"
Draco asked again.
"No one."
Scabia's eyes flicked towards Hermione, blown wide with fear.
"Just want to deliver this message. Your parents are dead."
Draco loosed his hold on Scabia's neck just long enough to drive his fist into the man's jaw. Hermione heard the crack of bone and flinched when Scabia spat out a tooth.
"You're lying. The Dark Lord knows of your betrayal,"
he hissed, chest rising off the floor.
"Your mother went first. Flayed alive, I hear, by the Dark Lord himself. Your father cried as he watched and begged for the end. You aren't obliged to him."
Another bloody grin.
"Eventually."
Hermione caught Draco's fist before he could land another blow. He looked over at her, eyes wild and snapping with rage.
"Let me go!"
"We need more," she said to him, then turning to Scabia. "When did this happen?" He glared at her.
"My blood be—"
Hermione applied the spell again, eyes and heart hardened as she listened to Scabia's shrieks. When she ended the spell, sweat had beaded on his forehead. She could see his pulse racing at his throat.
"This morning." "How did he know?"
Scabia's eyes turned back to Draco.
"Wasn't just a carol stationed here. One of Fenrir's pack was ordered to hang back, to survive and get the story. You thought you were so careful."
The Death Eater sat with a laugh.
"But the Dark Lord always knows. He will always know." "I've heard enough."
Draco put his hand on either side of Scabia's head, and, with a heave, struck his skull against the stone floor. Hermione's stomach flipped at the sickening crack. Scabia's eyes fluttered close, and Hermione did not linger to find out if he were dead or unconscious. She lurched towards the eastern point door and wretched into the scrub grass. Draco nudged her shoulder, holding a canteen out for her. She took it, swished, and spit to rinse her mouth, then took a small sip to clear her throat.
"We need to get to Malfoy Manor," Draco said. "Now."
No," she croaked, straightening, trying to ignore the blood spattered across Draco's chin. "I can't operate us."
"You can," he said. "The drawing room, you remember it?"
The room where she'd been tortured. She'd never forget it. It was an unusual space. Marble columns in the Doric style. Dark wood floor, arched wooden beams along the ceiling, balconies on either end. A grand chandelier. little more than shots now. Phantom pain set her nerves aflame. Nevertheless, Hermione fisted her hands and set her chin. "Yes," she said, "I remember." He held out a drawstring pack for her. She slung it over her shoulders. "Take us there." "Isn't that what they'll expect?" "Probably, but I need to know," Draco muttered. Hermione shifted her weight, unconvinced. "What if they're still there?" "They won't be. The manor is without a master. Anyone who remained after Lucius took his last breath will have been transported to outside the front gates. I have no doubt that Bellatrix has started processing the property transfer, but until she updates the family ledger in the Gringotts vault, the manor will have closed to everyone but me." "Including me?" Draco frowned. She'd identified a hitch in his plan. He stood before her, his mind working through the options. Hermione waited patiently. Draco knew the Malfoy magic better than she ever could, understood the rules and bindings of his ancestral home and natural loopholes that existed to bypass them. Without a warning, Draco took her right hand. He pulled the signet ring off her middle finger, took her left hand and shoved the ring past the knuckle on her fourth finger. The ring tightened, grew warm, and before she could yank her hand away, Draco pulled her forward. Hermione opened her mouth to argue and met his with the clash of hot breath and the click of teeth. Her knees buckled as his hands cupped her face, holding her steady as he kissed her, urgent and impatient. The movement of his lips and sweeping of his tongue felt like both a curse and a promise. Hermione's heart began to rise. It felt like a vow. He let her go, eyes half-lidded and uncharacteristically soft. Pressed another kiss, soft this time, chaste, almost penitent, against the corner of her mouth. "Let's go." "What did you do?" she whispered, cold with dawning horror. She looked down at the ring on her left hand, disbelieving. "I solved one of our problems," he said, taking her arm. "You're welcome." "Take it back." She tried to pull the ring off, but her fingers kept slipping. She couldn't find purchase against the tight metal. I don't! "Get us out of here, Granger." "Please!" She fisted her hands in his shirt and looked up at him with tearful eyes. "Please take it back. I don't want this." "Neither did my parents." She didn't know if he meant their marriage or their assumed death. "We're running out of time." He dragged her by the hand to the eastern point of Inchgarvey, just a few feet from the waterline. The shush of the waves against the rocks steadied her somewhat, pulled her from her sprawling panic, and reminded her of the world beyond the confines of her own disastrous life. Draco was right. There'd been a problem. He'd solved it. There was no love between them, nothing that would keep them together once their hellish, ad hoc rescue mission reached its end. It wasn't permanent. It couldn't be. But as she steadied herself for apparition, she heard the echo of her grandmother's voice in her mind. "Much is weathered by time and tide." To be continued. Thank you for listening to this chapter of Time and Tide by Misdemeanor1331. If you'd like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on Spotify, YouTube, or AO3.